Okay, now that we've created our very own class, or our very own method, let's try creating our very own class. So to do that, there's a couple ways you can do it. The easiest way probably to do it is to go up, right-click on your solution, and click Add, and then click New File. And you'll get this nice little dialog box asking you what kind of file you'd like to create. And you've got a series of possibilities over here, little categories that they might fit in. And these are the ones you're going to see when you're working in Unity. But right now we're working outside of Unity, so let's just stick with an empty class. And I'm going to call my class character. So remember, this is a Dungeons and Dragons simulator. Everything revolves generally around characters. And I'm going to do .cs. That's the most common extension for C# code files. I'll click New, and it will go ahead and make this for me. And now let's create our very own class. Now, if I were going to do this, I would probably go through a modeling exercise and figure out what everything was going to be ahead of time. But I really just wanted to show you something that includes pretty much everything you'd see in a common class of this type. This class is not going to be very complicated. It's going to just contain some basic properties for a Dungeons and Dragons character, and it's going to contain a few of the elements that you need to be successful in general programming if this is the first time that you've ever seen this stuff. Alright, so I think there's a few things I'm going to do. I'm going to get rid of the auto-generated thing. By the way, this makes me laugh out loud every time I see it. But let's get rid of it. It's not doing me any good. Just clutter. Alright. If you've ever played Dungeons & Dragons, basically the way it works is you have a character that you play, and you basically manipulate that character just as you would a character in a video game, except instead of manipulating him in a 3D environment on the screen, it's all imaginary. So it's kind of a nice metaphor. It's something you've all done. It's just maybe you haven't played the exact game before. So the character that you have, that represents you, has a couple of properties to it. And we're going to start off doing it the rigid Java way so that I can show you that way to do it. And then I'm going to go back and show you some nice little things that C# has to reduce the amount of typing that you have to perpetrate in order to get a class working. So we're going to start off with properties. And I'm just putting that there so you'll know what's going on. You don't have to put that in there. That's just a comment. So let's do a few properties for our character. Every character has a name. Oh, I'm doing the Java way, sorry. In the Java way, everything is private. And when I'm doing a private variable, I'm going to follow the naming convention. Private variables are always underscore and then a lowercase like that. And then if you're going to do more than that, then you would have camel case after that, which you'll see in just a minute. So let's do an integer called hit points, like so. See how I did the camel case? We've got, on the second word, an uppercase. And these are just conventions. You don't have to do it this way. But this is what you're going to see most common in a C# program. So every character has a name, every character has hit points, and every character has something called a class. Now, a class and if we're going to use the old rules, you can be a fighter, you can be a magic user, you can be a cleric, or you can be a thief. Those are the possibilities. Yes, they added lots more later on, like monks and all different kinds of specialty classes. That was really just to sell you more books. The original Dungeons & Dragons had 4 classes that I remember, and those are them. So, how do we do this? We could do private string class. Oh, we got a keyword. That's a no-no. You do private string class like that, and then you just make the user type in one of those 4 things. Well, that's not the best way to do it because people make mistakes, and it would be really easy to misspell fighter. Or what do you do with the space in the middle of magic user? That's kind of awkward. It's just kind of weird. So it would be better if you could do some sort of numerical system for this. So we could make this an integer. And you could just agree that, for example, 0 is a fighter, 1 is a magic user, and so on. Okay, that's better. At least you're not going to have any ambiguity in the value. But now I have to remember that 0 is a fighter, 1's a magic user, 2 is a cleric, and 3 is a thief, and I could really see myself making mistakes with that. No, really, the best thing for a class is going to be make it something called an enum or an enum. You could say it either way. You should say enum because it's short for enumeration, but it looks like enum. So an enum is a way of representing something as a number, but giving it something that you can actually remember. So let's go ahead and make an enum. An enum is a structure that exists outside of the class, and I'm going to take advantage of the fact that you can have multiple things in a single namespace. And I'm going to make a public enum called character classes. And I'm going to say fighter, magic user, cleric, and thief. Okay, now that I've got that, I can make this character classes. I guess we should probably change this. It should be character class. That's a little more grammatically correct. Character class. And now it can just be one of those. And I'll show you how this, so I'll kind of do a spoiler here. I'll go ahead and set it so you can see what that looks like. I can say class equals, it's going to bring up the enumeration character class for me, dot. Oops, I misspelled cleric. It's going to do them in alphabetical order, but it knows that they are numerically. This is going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. Let me fix my cleric. That's better. Okay. All right, I'm going to take that out for now. But just know that it will be limited to those 4 values. You can't put anything in there that isn't one of those 4 values. So earlier when we had an integer, what happens if I put 10 in there? That's a legal value, or negative 50. It's not going to know what that is. Probably going to cause an error in my program. Errors are bad. Let's stay away from errors. So an enum it allows you to limit the values and also to put them in something that you can easily use instead of having to memorize long number lists. What if you wanted to do states? State is a great enumeration. There are 50 states. Wouldn't you like to do state dot Oklahoma, state dot Texas, state dot Wyoming, instead of having to remember that Wyoming is which number of state? I have no idea. So it's just much easier to use enumerations. Okay, so we've got a few things in here, and that's all well and good, but they're all private, which means anyone using this class is not going to be able to see them. Let me show you how to do an instantiation so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. If I go back over to main, I'm going to get rid of some of my old stuff. In fact, I'm going to get rid of pretty much everything. Get rid of that, and I'll go ahead and get rid of my not so useful function or method. And now let's just stick to our Dungeons and Dragons thing, and let's create a new character. Okay, this is called instantiation. You're creating an instance of something, and that's called instantiation. So let's create an instance of the character class, and we'll say character, my character equals new character. Okay, or if you want to do the implicit way, you can say var my character equals new character. Since it can see you're creating new character, you're assigning it, the implicit way is just fine. New is a keyword that tells you, or that tells the compiler that we're creating a new instance of this particular class. And you'll notice that it has these little parentheses here. What does that usually tell you? If you're sticking up your hand going, ooh, ooh, meat, meat, it means a function, you'd be absolutely right. Except we're not using a function directly, are we? We're instantiating a new class. So how come that's there? Let's go back to our character class and look. Oh, look. There is a function there. It's called character, and it's got two braces after it. This is called a constructor. It's a special method on every class. Whenever you instantiate a class. So instantiation. It's a special method that gets called on instantiation automatically. If you don't put one in there, the compiler just generates an empty one for you. So it's always there whether or not you create it or use it. And what this is useful in doing usually is setting up your class. So in this case, I would like to go ahead and make sure that there's always something in my name. So let's do name equals string.empty. And now I don't have a null in there. That nulls are generally your enemy. You don't want to mess around with nulls too much if you don't have to. They can cause a lot of problems and they're kind of hard to detect. So if you can avoid nulls, then you should. I'm going to set my hit points equal to 0. And that's just a good starting point. Now, if you wanted to, there's really no reason to have negative hit points, is there? So what you can do is you can make this an unsigned integer, and that would be fine too. So you just kind of iteratively make little changes as you go. All right. So there is a good example of how to use a constructor. You can use it to set up your class ahead of time. Now, there's another way to do this. There's always another way to do it, right? You can go ahead and initialize them up here if you want to. And that's legal too. Just completely depends on how you want to do it. I'm going to stick with the constructor just so that you're aware that the constructor is there, how to use a constructor. Not every language supports that nice little initialization at the top that make you use a constructor. So I'm going to stick with the constructor just because that's the academically sound thing to do. But you can go ahead and initialize up here if you want to. There's nothing wrong with that. All right, so the next one that I haven't, the only thing I haven't initialized yet is character class. And I realize that I have 4 choices here. I should probably have 5, just in terms of good design. I'll add one here called unknown so I can tell that it has not yet been set or initialized. And I will tell it to initialize it to that. There we go. Okay, so that is a great use of your constructor. Now, for the next little bit, I want you to focus on private. And I'm going to add something to it that's very temporary. We're just going to put it in here. I'll go back over to main. And we've created an instance of our character. Now we can start manipulating it. So we can say my character. And when we hit the dot, it's going to tell us everything that is visible on that object. Now by default, we get a few things from C#'s object class itself. We get a comparison method called equals. We get a hash code, get hash code. We get type, which tells you the type. And we get toString, which usually doesn't do much for you. And then the last thing that says you see this you can see me thing. And that F is telling you that it's a field. Remember, field, property, and instance variable are all interchangeable terms. So that's what that red F means. And it's saying you can see me. You'll notice that's the only one that you can see. And that's because we're using something called encapsulation or access modifiers to hide all of these elements. Now remember, we're still pretty much in Java mode with respect to this one. And in Java, at least the way it's traditionally taught in universities, says that you should encapsulate everything. You should never show anything, which is a little bit tedious. But we're going to do it the good old-fashioned CS way, and then I'll show you a little more practical way. What all this really does is it forces you to write a lot more code than you need to. So if everything's private, now we need something called accessor methods. These are methods that allow you to expose these privately held variables. So an accessor method is also called a getter and setter. You'll hear me say getters and setters. This is what I'm talking about. All right, so there's two things that you have to do to a variable most of the time. You want to be able to get it, which is read it, and you want to be able to set it. So let's create an accessor method for name. In this case, we're going to do a getter and a setter. A getter is going to return whatever type that is. So we're going to say string, since we're going to expose name. Name is a string, and we're going to say get name. And then we just say return name, because nothing really happens in here that's important. And then we'll do the setter. Oops, this one doesn't have a return type. Set name. Okay, so this is what a set of accessor methods looks like. So here's how we're exposing our name variable. We're using accessor methods to do it. Let's go back over to main so we can see what this looks like. Again, my character, as soon as you hit the dot, it's going to show you everything that's publicly accessible. If you want to access the name, then you can get it with the get name, or you can set it with the set name. So we can say set name, and then we can say something like this, and we can get it like so. Oh, it's a method, so we have to do that. All right. So that's an accessor set of accessor methods, getters and setters. There's one more thing to show you on this point, and that is that not everything has to be accessible. So take, for example, hit points. We might not want to expose that directly to someone to set it to whatever they want. We might want to create a different method that handles that. So maybe we can do public void, it's an int get hit points. And that's fine. But we're not going to allow them to set the hit points. So this is a read-only variable is what we have here. Let's go back and add that comment. We're not allowing the user of this class to set the value. We're just going to make it read-only, and then we're going to set the hit points through some other method. All right, so like I said, lots of typing. Probably not all that necessary. It certainly isn't necessary for name. Sometimes what you'll see in these, and the reason why they exist, is because they want you to do validation here. So validation might be you can't set it to something that's empty. So we could do a quick check. We could say if, well, no, I'm getting ahead of myself. I don't want to get too fancy here. We'll do validation logic when we cover if statements, control flow, things like that. But there's more stuff that you could put in here to make sure that they're not sticking something in there that ought not to be there. So let me show you that's the old way. Let me show you the C# way. Which is a little bit nicer. Instead of making everything private, there's actually two ways you could do this. If you really don't care what goes in there, you could make it a public string. Okay, now you don't need accessor methods at all. You can come over here and do whatever you want to it. So now you can say my character dot, and it'll show up. Now by naming convention, we shouldn't have that underscore in there. If you're going to expose it to the outside world, make it look pretty, and that's just a little bit nicer to look at. But that's all it is. It's just a naming convention. It's not a requirement. That just looks nice. It looks like everything else now. Okay, that's one way of doing it, probably the easiest way of doing it. The more widely accepted way is through a little something we call syntactical sugar. That's a nice way of saying they've added this cool little feature that makes your life a little bit easier, reduces the amount of typing, and makes the syntax a little nicer. I'm going to put this back to what it was. And what you can do is you can set it to public, and then you can say get set like this. Get rid of your last one. And what this is telling it is to just go ahead and generate the same getter and setter that we had earlier. So it's not doing anything. All it does is it gets the value and it sets the value. So that saves you a lot of typing and still honors the idea that everything should be encapsulated. So you get the best of both worlds. You can be academically correct, and at the same time you don't have to type 2 entire methods into your code. You can set them up this way. The other advantage here is that it looks like anything else that you might try to use. So now it's going to show up as P for property, because that's how it thinks a property should be designated. So that's a little bit nicer, and that's the method that we're going to be using. Now if you wanted to do stuff within the get and set, we'll cover that later, like I said, when we cover things like if statements and loops and anything that you might want to use in there you can use. And it's a slightly different syntax, but if you don't want it to do much other than just get and set the value, there you go. Remember, we've already set it to an empty string in our constructor, so it's not as though it's empty. They could set it to null if they wanted to, but they would have to go out of their way to do it.